do you have an opinion on the so-called, analytic-continental divide? Are you an analytic philosopher, and should we hate the continental folks?
Yeah, basically. So,
That's great.
What you should do in philosophy is these are some things that are important. Number one, be clear, like in what you're saying, so people know what the hell you're saying. Number two, give arguments for your views if they're not obvious. Like, if you're taking controversial view, give a reason for it. And number three, address objections. Right? Like, what would the counter argument be from the other side, and then talk about that, and then try to say your response. And continental philosophers don't do any of those.
What's your opinion about non-analytical philosophy? I despise it. Do you have any precision on that, or maybe any motivation?
Well, there may be. I mean, non-analytic philosophy is a very broad term, so I don't want to say that it's all bad. I'm sure there were good Nazis, but what bothers. I'm sorry.
There are certainly some features that you
yeah.
dislike.
So the main thing that I dislike about this is that it's fraudulent. I genuinely believe that many of the people who are doing it, indeed, who are quite famous, are frauds.
Nobody told me in school that some professional philosophers think that the whole edifice of continental philosophy could essentially be worthless, or worse, fraudulent. Derrida, Hegel, Heidegger, Schelling, all these guys could be frauds? Although only some scholars seem to reject continental philosophy in its entirety, there are recent academic papers doubting its validity. To gain a better understanding of this issue, this video will present one of the most common arguments against continental philosophy, or at least a variation of it. But before proceeding, we need to define what continental philosophy actually is. Definitions can be tricky, and the case of continental philosophy is hardly an exception. For our purposes, we will employ one of the definitions proposed in the relevant literature, which characterizes continental philosophy by its distinctive narrative style of writing. This style is denoted by a more narrated approach to philosophical discourse, where the arguments presented are not always explicitly structured. A reader may be able to understand the theme that is being discussed, and vaguely whether the author supports or opposes a position, but the argument is harder to reconstruct precisely. What we mean by that is that the premises and conclusions of arguments are not made immediately apparent to the reader. Furthermore, in this style, the author does not explicitly provide the definitions of the concepts used, nor indicate their origins, if there are any. And, additionally, this narrative approach does not usually address counter-arguments to the thesis of the writings. According to this definition, prototypical examples of philosophers who engaged in continental philosophy would include Heidegger, Hegel, Derrida, and the list goes on. This does not imply that all their works fall under this characterization, but many of their writings do. Although this distinction appears kind of superficial at first glance, after all, it seems like it's just all a matter of style. The argument we will develop aims to demonstrate that it is actually profoundly substantive. First premise. The writing of continental philosophers is supposed to carry some information, some knowledge that the author is trying to share. Prima facie, this premise doesn't seem very controversial, but we will discuss it later. Second premise. Utilizing the continental style of philosophizing exacerbates the interpretation problem. Language can be a tricky thing, and people can read into the same book, into the same text, into the same paragraph, different meanings. In philosophy, this is sometimes called the problem of hermeneutic misinterpretation. The famous post-structuralist Jacques Derrida is but one philosopher who famously discussed this topic, apparently suggesting that the problem of interpretation may actually be insurmountable. Or at least this is what common interpretations of his work suggest. While it is widely acknowledged that human communication often involves interpretative challenges, Many academics believe these can be mitigated. Otherwise, it would be hard to explain how the entire edifice of mathematics or physics came about, that has built a body of knowledge that carefully rests on previous axioms, definitions, and proofs. If human interpretation were infinitely varied, it would be difficult to understand how physical or mathematical concepts have been reliably transmitted across generations. Mathematicians would say that to avoid misunderstandings, they carefully define each new concept they use, and try to be as clear as possible with their arguments. Anybody who has studied math at uni will quickly tell you that they are incredibly anal about this stuff, but maybe it's for a good reason. Not structuring your argument and not providing definitions of words you have in mind can quickly lead to a myriad of interpretations that increase exponentially with each new undefined term introduced. If then other philosophers continue to build on continental works using the same continental style, the problem can compound, leading to an ever-increasing level of semantic noise. And, in essence, if there is too much semantic noise in a text, it's going to be hard to reliably extract information from it. Possible evidence of this phenomenon happening in continental philosophy is seen in the diverse interpretations that experts, not laymen's experts, offer of various authors' works. For instance, some professional philosophers say that for Hegel, reality is ultimately a manifestation of an all-encompassing absolute spirit, while others say that the absolute represents the fullest articulation of concepts, and it's not an all-encompassing metaphysical entity. Professional philosophers have debates about Heidegger's concept of being. Some interpret it one way, while others see it another. Scholars debate Deleuze's philosophy of difference. Does it constitute a new form of ontology, or is it a challenge to the very concept of ontology itself? And the list goes on and on. In mathematics and in physics, this happens much less, if at all. The problem is not one of interpreting other mathematicians correctly, and there aren't really big ongoing debates on what mathematicians of the past said or meant. Mathematicians would certainly attribute much of the success of mathematics to its rigor, that helps ameliorate the problem of hermeneutic misinterpretation. Premise 3. Exacerbating the interpretation problem hinders, and in some cases can completely impede, the proper sharing of information, and consequently, the building of knowledge. When interpretation issues are rampant, experts must spend significant time and resources trying to discern and decipher the meaning of a text, with no guarantee that they will be able to reconstruct the author's original argument, which in some cases could be lost forever. For instance, experts often disagree on what Hegel was trying to say in a particular chapter or paragraph, and sometimes they seem to literally just give up. Apparently, information is being lost. In this light, the style and clarity of writings are not merely cosmetic concerns, but incredibly substantive issues. Excessive semantic noise can obscure the claims being made, making it near impossible to evaluate if they are true or not, hindering the effective transmission of knowledge. Conclusion. Continental philosophy hinders or does not allow for the sharing of information, undermining its goal of conveying knowledge, and is thus deeply flawed. Let's now consider 3 possible counter-arguments to the argument we just presented. First, it's possible that continental philosophy is not focused on conveying specific knowledge or constructing neat little arguments, but maybe the idea is to get a general message across. Perhaps the aim is to convince the most people possible to adopt a life philosophy. Or perhaps it is trying to persuade or influence society for the better by giving spiritual or political inspiration. Like, try to be more tolerant of others. If this is the case and continental philosophy is a form of rhetorical persuasion, then there is a big risk involved, in that the arena of continental philosophy could devolve into becoming just a power game, in which it is not he who speaks the truth that wins, but he who is the most persuasive. Under this reading, a form of philosophy that does not state arguments, but aims to influence and persuade, risks being branded as a form of sophistry. Another counter-argument could be to accept that continental philosophy makes the interpretation problem worse, but to argue that the continental way has other benefits, like making the writing more readable, more inspiring, more entertaining, and that has value in itself. This counter-argument basically says that something can be deeply flawed but still have value, be it to galvanize, to amuse, or to stimulate. This could be, but a potential problem with taking things in this direction is that one risks blurring the distinction between literature and philosophy. Lastly, one could argue that the definition we gave of continental philosophy is too narrow, in the sense that it doesn't really capture a great deal of what one would think continental philosophy actually is. Okay, this is all well and good, but something remains unaddressed. Why the animosity towards continental philosophers? Why go as far as calling them frauds? The argument we presented doesn't necessarily imply malice, but some philosophers do. Some believe that continental philosophers might have been perfectly aware of the interpretation problem, and they played into it, exploiting biases present in human cognition to benefit off of the appearances of wisdom. According to this view, some continental philosophers might have cleverly anticipated that readers would find it psychologically challenging to abandon a book or a lecture by branding it nonsensical, captured by a choice-supporting bias and a sunk cost fallacy. So readers would strive to perceive patterns where none exist, apophenia, a thing humans excel at, leading them to make sense of passages with no meaning. Meanwhile, an authority bias would discourage questioning the clarity and validity of a professor's argument, thereby keeping the philosophers shielded from critique. But this could be a topic for another video.